Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Panic Peak. Let me know where you're listening from in the world by leaving a comment, and don't forget to subscribe for more horror stories. Now, let's dive in. Story 1. The Unheard Choir. In the shadow of a forgotten town, nestled in a dense, almost impenetrable forest, stood an old mansion known only to locals as the Choir House. The mansion was an unsettling sight, its windows dark, its gates rusted with age, and its once proud exterior now crumbling with decay. Few dared venture near it, for an air of dread clung to the property, like a forgotten secret waiting to be unearthed. The locals rarely spoke of it, but the children whispered stories. They said that on certain nights, when the wind howled just right, you could hear faint, high-pitched voices floating through the trees, a choir singing in the dead of night. The voices were said to be sweet, haunting, and far too beautiful to belong to anything of this world. It was a sound that both lured and terrified, drawing those who heard it closer, only to disappear when you tried to find its source. The mansion once belonged to the Leclerc family, renowned musicians who were said to have played before kings and queens. They had hosted extravagant recitals in their home, filling the grand ballroom with melodies so beautiful, so complex, that they were said to leave their listeners weeping. But one fateful evening, the entire family vanished without a trace after one such performance. The police found no sign of a struggle, no clue as to where they went. The mansion was abandoned, left to rot, its keys lost to time. But as the years passed, whispers continued to swirl around the house. The mansion wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. The voices, the humming, the melodies in the night, they were all part of the legend. Some said the Leclercs had sold their souls for eternal fame, and the price had been their very lives. Others claimed the voices were the souls of those who had attended their final recital, forever bound to the mansion. Sylvie, a curious thrill-seeker and skeptic of all things supernatural, had heard the stories many times but had never believed them. She laughed them off as the work of overactive imaginations. So when her friends dared her to spend the night in the mansion, she didn't hesitate. "Fine," she said, smirking, "but I'm recording the whole thing. If I don't hear anything spooky, you all owe me drinks for the next month." Her friends laughed nervously, but they made the bet anyway, knowing Sylvie was the type to take any challenge head-on. With her flashlight, a sleeping bag, and her phone for recording, she made her way to the mansion late one evening. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and mildew as she pushed open the rusty iron gates. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette black against the darkening sky. As Sylvie stepped through the threshold, the air felt colder than she expected, but she brushed it off, pressing forward. The parlor was musty and filled with layers of dust, the furniture draped in faded sheets, and the grand piano in the corner sat eerily still, its ivory keys yellowing with age. "This place is a dump," Sylvie muttered to herself, pulling out her phone to record. She zoomed in on the dusty piano. "But I bet I could make it out alive. No ghosts here, folks." She took a few more steps inside, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. The mansion was silent, almost too silent, the kind of silence that made her skin prickle, as though the house was watching her. Then she heard it. A faint hum. At first it was barely audible, a soft, lilting sound carried on the wind. Sylvie froze, her heart skipping a beat. It sounded like a voice. No, several voices, high-pitched, harmonic, as if a choir was gently warming up. She laughed nervously, attributing it to the wind or perhaps her imagination. "Creepy," she whispered into the camera, grinning despite the unease crawling up her spine. "You guys hear that? It's coming from upstairs, I think." But when she glanced at the staircase, it seemed as though the house itself was holding its breath. The shadows seemed deeper, darker than before. The hum continued, clearer now, almost like a lullaby, as though it was beckoning her. Sylvie's curiosity took over. She couldn't resist. She grabbed her flashlight and headed for the stairs. The staircase creaked under her weight as she ascended, the old wood groaning like a tired old man. The humming grew louder, more distinct, as if it were coming from the walls themselves. At the top of the stairs, she found a door she hadn't noticed before. It was ornate, with twisted carvings that looked almost like faces, their expressions frozen in an eternal scream. Despite the door being slightly ajar, there was a strange feeling in the air, like something wanted to keep her out. But Sylvie, ever bold, pushed the door open. The room before her was the grand ballroom, though it had not seen a dance in decades. The once gilded chandeliers hung crooked, their crystals swaying in the silence like pendulums. The air was thick with dust, and the walls seemed to hum with the weight of time. Against the far wall stood a massive antique organ, its blackened pipes towering like twisted trees. The keys were warped and yellow, untouched for years. But the hum? It was unmistakable. And there they were. Figures. They stood in the center of the room, arranged in a circle, facing inward. Their figures were pale, nearly translucent, their features almost indistinguishable from one another. Their mouths hung open, as if frozen mid-song, but the sound came from them, echoing through the room. It was the choir, the voices that had been haunting the mansion. Sylvie's heart raced. These were no ordinary figures. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow and black. The humming wasn't just a sound, it was a presence, a vibration that shook her very soul. The air around them seemed to warp, as though the room itself was alive, breathing, listening. A sudden chill swept through the ballroom, and Sylvie shivered. Her phone slipped from her hand and fell to the floor with a dull thud, the screen still recording. She reached for the door, but it slammed shut behind her with a deafening bang, the sound rattling through her bones. She spun around, panic flooding her chest, as the humming grew louder, more insistent. The figures moved, but not in the way she expected. Their heads turned toward her, slow and deliberate. Their mouths stretched open, wider and wider, until their faces seemed to collapse into grotesque, silent screams. The sound, the hum, began to shift, turning into a discordant, painful wail. It was as though the music itself was alive, hungry, pulling her toward them. Sylvie's legs turned to jelly. She screamed, but her voice was lost in the cacophony of sound. Her eyes locked onto the organ. It seemed to grow, its pipes twisting toward her, bending like gnarled fingers reaching for her. With a strangled cry, she turned to flee. But the room shifted, the walls stretching and closing in around her, trapping her in a nightmarish maze of shadows and sound. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stumbled back toward the door. But it was too late. The figures were upon her now, their eyes dark and endless, and their voices merged into a single unholy song that filled her head, drowning her in its melody. The world went black. The next morning, the townsfolk gathered to search for Sylvie, knowing she had gone to the mansion the night before. When they found her, they were shocked to find her lying in the ballroom, curled in a ball on the dusty floor. Her eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness, her lips parted as though she had been trying to scream. But there was no sound. Sylvie was alive, but her voice was gone, stolen, it seemed, by the choir house. They buried her story as they had buried the others before her. The mansion was sealed once more, and the locals kept their distance. Yet, on certain nights, when the wind picked up and the moon was high, the humming could still be heard. It was clearer now, fuller, as though the choir had grown. Some said Sylvie had joined them, her voice lost forever to the eternal song of the Leclercs. End of the story. Story 2. The Silent Ridge. Anna had always dreamed of escaping the noise of the world, leaving behind the constant hum of city life. When she discovered a secluded cabin on the edge of a dense forest, miles away from the nearest neighbor or phone signal, it felt like the perfect retreat. a place to finally disconnect and reconnect with herself. A small ad in an online listing promised a peaceful retreat, and she, tired of the grind, jumped at the opportunity. The cabin was rustic, nestled at the base of a steep ridge, surrounded by trees so old that they seemed to whisper to each other in the wind. The road leading to it was overgrown with ivy and wildflowers, forgotten by time and civilization. It was the kind of place one would expect to find in a fairy tale, isolated, quiet, untouched. She arrived on a cool autumn afternoon. The sky was painted in streaks of orange and pink as she unloaded her car, feeling a sense of relief wash over her as the engine's hum faded into the distance. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. She marveled at the stillness, broken only by the rustling of the leaves under her boots and the occasional call of a bird echoing through the forest. At first, everything seemed perfect. The cabin was small but charming, with a stone fireplace and large windows that allowed sunlight to pour in during the day. She spent her time hiking the trails, gathering wood for the fire, and reading books she'd long neglected. The silence was a balm for her tired soul, the isolation liberating in a way she hadn't expected. But after a few days, the serenity began to feel strange. It was subtle at first, an odd flicker in her peripheral vision when she walked through the woods, a fleeting shadow that seemed to slip between the trees. At night, the air grew thick with a silence that pressed in on her, a silence so complete it felt unnatural. Sometimes she'd hear the soft rustle of something in the underbrush, only to find nothing there when she turned. The small, creeping feeling that she was being watched started to gnaw at her, and she couldn't shake the impression that she wasn't alone in the woods. One evening, as twilight descended, she was sitting on the porch with a cup of tea, staring out at the horizon, when she saw it. Far in the distance, beyond the edge of the forest, stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and cloaked in shadow, so much so that it blended into the darkening woods. The figure was still, unmoving, its presence cold and heavy in the air. It had no face, just a hood that obscured its features, but Anna could feel its eyes on her, piercing through the distance. The sight made her blood run cold, and she blinked, thinking it was nothing more than a trick of the light. But when she looked again, it was still there, watching. Anna's heart began to race, but she tried to calm herself. It could be anyone, a wanderer, maybe someone who also found this isolated spot. She rubbed her eyes and turned back to her tea, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The figure was still there, unmoving. She couldn't take her eyes off it, but when she finally managed to look away, it was gone. The next day, she found something strange. On the front door of the cabin there was a mark, scratched into the wood with something sharp. It was deep, jagged, as though done with intent. The design was simple, almost crude. 3 slashes, 1 vertical, 2 horizontal, forming an X. Her skin prickled. Could it have been an animal? But there were no claw marks, nothing that looked like it was made by nature. The scratches seemed deliberate. But by whom? That night the whispers began. At first it was a soft sound, barely audible, like the wind through the trees. But when Anna lay in bed, the sounds became more distinct. Words unintelligible at first, but with an edge of urgency. The whispers would slither into her ears, just loud enough to unsettle her. She pulled the covers tighter, telling herself it was the wind, the house settling, her imagination running wild. But deep down she felt the weight of something watching her, waiting for her to slip. By the 4th night, the whispers had grown louder, more demanding. "Go," they seemed to say. "Leave now." It was not the wind. No, this voice felt like it was coming from inside the walls, from the floorboards beneath her feet, from the very earth itself. Anna couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin sent her heart into overdrive. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, to move closer. She tried to drown out the sound by turning on the radio, but the static only intensified, distorting the words, making them sound more like commands than warnings. That morning, she packed her things in a rush, unable to shake the feeling that she was being suffocated by the forest. She needed to leave. She had to leave. But as she stepped outside, her legs felt weak, her feet unsteady. The air had become thick, like a fog pressing against her chest. The path leading back to the road, the path she'd walked so many times before, was gone. In its place was an unbroken sea of trees, their trunks twisted and blackened, like something out of a nightmare. The ridge, the one she had hiked every morning, had disappeared into an endless expanse of wild forest. She turned in every direction, trying to find some sign of the familiar, but everything looked the same. The trees were the same. The ground felt different beneath her feet, shifting, as though the earth itself was alive and moving. That's when she heard it. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. They came from behind her, dragging against the dirt, growing closer with each passing second. She spun around, but there was no one there. The silence returned, pressing in around her. The whispers returned too, but this time they were louder, closer. "You can't leave," they hissed, a chorus of voices that seemed to come from all directions. "You are already home." Her breath caught in her throat. The figure appeared then, standing at the edge of the trees. It was even taller than before, its hooded face now visible in the dim light, though there were no features, just a darkness, a void that swallowed all light. Its eyes, glowing faintly, locked onto hers, and she felt her entire body freeze. Fear, pure and overwhelming, gripped her heart. She backed away, heart pounding in her chest, but the ground beneath her feet felt unstable. With each step she took, the trees closed in tighter, the forest shifting like it was alive. More figures emerged from the shadows, their shapes blurred and indistinct, but all were watching her with those same hollow eyes. "You'll stay with us," one whispered, its voice like the crackling of leaves underfoot. "Forever." As the darkness pressed in around her, Anna's legs gave out, her body collapsing to the ground. The whispers surrounded her, choking off her screams. She realized too late that the land had claimed her, that she had wandered too far into its depths. It wasn't just the trees or the creatures in the forest. The very land itself was hungry. And once it had marked her, it would never let her go. The last thing she saw before everything went black was the figure towering over her, its cold eyes locked with hers, and its voice echoing through her mind. "Welcome home." End of the story.